Okay, next what you want to go ahead and do is lay out the back bodice piece with the right side facing up. Now what we're going to do is add an ease stitch at the shoulder edge of the back bodice piece. That way we can ease the shoulder to match up with our front pattern pieces. Now I did, before I did that, what I went ahead and did was I serged the shoulder edges and also the bottom edge of my bodice on my back and also on my front pieces. I did that. Alright, to do the ease stitch, go ahead and turn your stitch length to the longest length on your machine. So for me that is a stitch length of 4.5. Go ahead and lower your needle. No need to back stitch. And I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to sew until I get to the other side. Alright, when you get to the other side, no need to back stitch. Alright, next what you want to go ahead and do is at one of the ends, grab, you'll see you have 2 tails of thread. You want to grab one of the tails and you just want to gently pull it just a little bit. Okay, and that's going to create a gathering effect. And you don't have to pull it too much because we don't need that much of an ease for it to fit our shoulder. So once you've gathered it a bit, what you want to do is now take the front pieces and you want to lay them right sides together. Okay, and I see that what I've pulled, and see I just did a little bit, not a lot, and now I see that my shoulders are lined up with each other. So what I'm going to do is, so that all of the gather isn't just in one place, I'm just going to distribute that evenly across the top. Alright, then you can go ahead and line up the notches in the shoulder, place a pin there, and then continue adding pins. Alright, so you want to repeat the process on the other side. Alright, next go ahead and line up the shoulder with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle. Begin sewing and back stitch. And keep sewing until you get to the end and back stitch again. Alright, you're going to repeat this process on the other shoulder, and then you can take this to your iron and press the seam open. Alright, next go ahead and grab your sleeve. Make sure that the wrong side of the sleeve is facing up. You can grab a seam gauge or you can use an index card. If you use an index card, measure from the bottom up 1/2 inch and then draw a 1/2 inch line. Then what you want to do is take your index card, and you'll do this at your iron. You'll, looking at the bottom edge, you'll fold it up to meet that 1/2 inch line. You'll take your iron and press. And you'll do that across the entire bottom. Once it has been pressed once, what you'll do now is take the edge and you'll fold it one more time inward. Alright, and then we will, once you have it pressed down, we'll take it to our sewing machine and do a top stitch. Alright, to do the top stitch, go ahead and, with the right side facing up, place the sleeve edge at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, begin sewing, and back stitch. Alright, keep sewing until you get to the end and back stitch again. All right, go ahead and take this to your iron and give it a nice press. Now you may have noticed that I did have some pins with this fabric. It doesn't like to lay flat after when I pressed it up, so I just used some pins to help reinforce my fabric to lay flat while I was sewing. All right, after you finish the bottom of the sleeve, what we're going to do is do an E-stitch along the top edge of the sleeve, and we'll do an E-stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, to do the E-stitch, go ahead and use the longest stitch on your machine. I'm using a 4.5. Next, go ahead and line up one end of the sleeve with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and make sure that you have a tail of threads at the end. Then go ahead and lower your needle. No need to backstitch. And you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, and when you get to the end, no need to backstitch. Just make sure that you leave a tail of threads at the end as well. All right, next go ahead and lay out your bodice. Right now I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. This is the front bodice piece and this is the back. And also lay out your sleeve with the wrong side facing up, and make sure that it's the appropriate sleeve. So you should have one notch lining up here, and you just want to double check before you start pinning, and that 2 notches here line up with the 2 notches in the back bodice piece. So go ahead and grab your pins. The first thing that you want to do is find that notch in the sleeve, the top one, and you want to line it up with the shoulder seam. So with right sides facing each other, go ahead and pin that in place. Now next, what you want to go ahead and do is grab your ease stitches, and you'll notice that there are 2 threads. You're only going to be pulling one of them. So I'm going to pull the top thread, and what I'm going to do is just gently begin pulling, and you see it's creating a gathering effect similar to our shoulder, and you just want to pull on those ease stitches. Now I'm going to see if I've pulled it enough, so I'm just going to do a test without pinning anything to line up the 2 notches in the sleeve with the 2 notches in the bodice. Alright, and I see that I've pulled it just enough. Now before I start pinning, what I'm going to do is, I don't want to have a bunch of the ease stitches clumped up together. So what I'm going to do is distribute those evenly. So I'm going to push it more towards the center. The only thing that you want to do as you're distributing is make sure that you don't go past those 2 notches, because then it'll be too big again. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and pin at the 2 notches. And I'm going to just a little bit more distribute my gathers. And once you like the way that your ease stitches have been distributed, you can go ahead and add some additional pins in there. Alright, and then I'm just going to finish pinning up this side. Alright, next I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. So pulling on my gathering stitches, see if it's been pulled enough. Once I see that it has, I'm just going to go ahead and pin at that single notch. And then once I've pinned there, I'm going to distribute my gathers evenly, and then go ahead and add some additional pins to hold that down in place. And then on the opposite side of the notch, I'm going to add some additional pins. Alright, go ahead and line up the sleeve with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go Go ahead and lower your needle and begin sewing. Back stitch. And keep sewing until you get to the end and back stitch again. Now it's okay to take your time on this part, especially trying to maneuver around the curve of this sleeve. So don't feel like you need to rush on this part. Take your time. And when I get to the area that has the E stitches, I like to just really take my time and make sure that my fabric is even and that I don't have any lumps, so I don't create any, so I'm not sewing over an extra layer of fabric or anything. So really make sure that when you get to the E stitch that you make sure everything is nice and flat before you begin sewing on top of it. Next, you could take this to your iron and press the seam going towards the sleeve. Now, before I press this out, I'm going to take this to my serger and I'm going to serge this edge. All right, next, go ahead and grab your belt loops. And with the right sides on the inside, you're going to fold the belt loop in half. And then you can place some pins along the edge. All right, next to sew this up, we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. But in order to do that, we're going to have the side that's on the fold be facing towards the seam. Be facing towards the seam. All right, with the folded edge lined up with 1/2 inch seam allowance, go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing, and back stitch, and keep sewing till you get to the end and back stitch again. All right, go ahead and repeat this process for the other belt loop. All right, to turn your belt loop, go ahead and take your loop turner, push it through your fabric. Then you want to latch it onto the fabric. And once it's latched, you can begin pulling the fabric through. And then once it starts coming out on the other side, you can take the turner off. And then just with your other hand, just begin pulling the rest of it out. And then once it's all on the right side, you can go ahead and take this to your iron and give it a nice press. All right, another option for the belt loop, if you don't have a loop turner or turning is a challenge for you, what you can do is take your belt loop, you want to fold it together, make sure that the right side is facing out and the wrong side is on the inside. You're folding it in half. Go ahead and take it to your iron. You're going to press that in place. That'll create a crease in the center. Then you'll take the outsides, fold it in to take the outsides, fold it in to meet that crease. And then you can press that with your iron. Then you'll fold these to meet each other. And that will create your belt loop. And you can press this in place, and then you can take it to your sewing machine and sew a stitch along the edge to secure the belt loop. Alright, next go ahead and lay out the bodice piece, the back bodice, with the right side facing up. So working on the right side of the fabric. Grab your pins and your belt loop. Now those 2 dots on the side, what you want to do is take one end of the belt loop, and on that dot you want to go ahead and place the belt loop on top, and then you're going to pin that down in place. Then you're going to take the other end of the belt loop and just turn it, or curve it, so that it meets the dot on the other side. And then you're going to place a pin there. All right, next what we're going to do is sew a basting stitch to hold our belt loop in place. All right, to attach the belt loop, go ahead and change your stitch to a basting stitch. So I'm using a 4.5 stitch length. And then starting at the top belt loop, go ahead and lower your needle. And there's no need to back stitch, just go ahead and start sewing. And I am using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to base this belt loop. Alright, once you get past the belt loop, you can just go ahead and stop. No need to back stitch, raise your needle. Alright, and you can go ahead and base the other belt loop the same exact way. Alright, next what we're going to do is sew up the side seam. So what you want to do is have your, right now I'm looking at the wrong side of the bodice piece. So this is my sleeve, this is the back bodice, this is the front. So you're going to, at the shoulder seam, go ahead and pick up your bodice. And then now you'll see that it's creating the sleeve and then now the bodice piece. So what we're going to do is begin pinning along this edge. So the first thing you want to do is line up. You want to line up the shoulder seam here in the arm, in the underarm, and place a pin there. You want to match up the, next you want to match up the notches in the sleeve and place a pin there. And then you also want to line up the sleeve here at the end and place a pin. Alright, and then you can add some additional pins in this area. Alright, next go ahead and match up the notches here in the bodice. Match up the ends of the bodice together. And then next go ahead and add some additional pins. Okay, next we're going to take this to our sewing machine and sew a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to close up our sleeve and bodice. Alright, starting at the bottom of the bodice, line up the edge with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle. Go ahead and begin sewing and back stitch. Alright, keep sewing until you reach the other end and back stitch again. Alright, next what I'm going to do is go ahead and serge this edge, and then I'm going to take it to my iron and press it going towards the back of the sleeve and towards the back of the bodice. Alright, next what you want to go ahead and do is lay out the skirt piece and make sure that the right side of the fabric is facing up. What you want to do is take your bodice piece, and I'm looking at the bottom edge of the bodice. You want to lay it now with the right side touching, the right sides touching together. So next we want to go ahead and pin these in place. So the first pin that you want to place is at the side seam. So match up the side seam of the bodice with the side seam of the pocket, where the pocket is. Alright, next you want to pin at the center back. So the center back of the bodice and also the center back of the skirt piece. Line those up and pin in place. Alright, next you want to line up the other side seam with the side seam of the bodice with the side seam of the skirt piece. Line those up and pin in place. Alright, now I'm going to pin the ends together. Right, next I'm going to add some additional pins along this edge. Alright, next we're going to take this to our sewing machine. Sew a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then we'll sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're going to sew this up twice. And we're doing that because sometimes the skirt piece might be a little bit heavy, and I like to do an extra stitch to accommodate for the weight of the skirt piece. Alright, go ahead and line up your seam with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. And continue sewing until you get to the other end and backstitch again. Alright, so we're going to sew up this waist seam one more time. So using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, go ahead and line up your fabric, lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. Then you'll keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Alright, after you have sewn the waist seam, make sure you press the seam going up towards the bodice of the jacket. Alright, another thing that I did was, I know that I serged the edges earlier, but to reduce the bulk, I went ahead and serged the edge again, joining the two pieces, and that's helping it to lay a little bit flatter.